Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's workshop. My name is David Wilcox. I'm the program leader for Fedora here at LYRASIS, joined by Danny Bernstein, who is the technical lead for the program. And Erin Griffith is also joining us to help out with some of the Q&A during the workshop. She works as the program coordinator for Fedora. So this is a brand new workshop, and thanks for joining us. It's the first time we've done a workshop with a little bit of technical prerequisites, just because the tools that we'll be using are sort of command line utilities and working with Docker and that sort of thing. You're of course welcome to just watch the demo if you'd like to do that. There's no requirement that you participate in the hands-on exercises, and of course the slides and the video will be made available afterwards if you want to sort of come back to this and go through it. But we are going to sort of take things slow and allow people time to kind of participate in the exercises throughout as we go. And let me just share, you should have received a PowerPoint version of the slides just before the workshop. But let me also share with everyone the Google Slides that I'll be working off of, just in case you'd prefer to follow along there. And in either case, if you're going to follow along with the hands-on content, I would recommend having the slides up, just because they have some links embedded in them and some things that you can copy and paste as we're going through the activities here. So with that, let me jump into things. So I wanted at the top here just to acknowledge that this training session and a lot of the tools that we'll be demonstrating and the documentation and all those things really come out of an Institute of Museum and Library Services IMLS funded grant project that we're currently working on, where we've been working with pilot partners to build out this tooling and documentation and test out pathways to Fedora 6 from Fedora 3. So again, links are embedded through the slides here, and happy to talk about the grant if folks are interested, but the link is there, and that's largely how we've been able to sort of fund these kinds of exercises and trainings. I will say too, if you have questions throughout the workshop, it's kind of easiest if you drop those into the Q&A function. You also have the chat box if you'd prefer to use that. Erin's going to be keeping an eye on that stuff, and where appropriate, we'll stop and pause things and address any questions that do come up. So just in terms of who this workshop is for, the focus really is on Fedora 3 repositories with a custom interface. Those of you that might be using an Islandora setup may still find this information useful in terms of how things work under the hood with Fedora, but there are other pathways for Islandora users to use. For the grant, we've been using Islandora Workbench, so that tends to be what we're kind of recommending there. And in the future, we'll have some training materials and workshops focused on that. Of course, the Islandora community has also put out some great Islandora Workbench materials. If you're a Samvera user, quite possibly this route will work for you as well. We have seen at least one user in the Samvera community successfully migrate their repository using some of these tools. But there's testing that's still going on for those users. And not mentioned here because this is focused on Fedora 3 repositories, but if you do have a Fedora 4 or 5 repository, we do have migration paths for those as well. I have some links at the end to some of those materials. So primarily today, we're going to be using a couple of tools in addition to a Docker container for Fedora 6. And those tools are the migration utils, which is a Java command line tool for migrating Fedora 3 content to OCFL, meaning the Oxford Common File Layout, either just plain OCFL or the OCFL that Fedora 6 uses. We're not talking a lot about OCFL here. I've talked about that in plenty of other presentations. If you're interested in learning more about that, just let us know. We can point you to some resources that dive in more specifically to OCFL and Fedora and those sorts of things. As well, we'll be using the Migration Validator. So this is a sort of complementary tool that was developed, again, as part of this grant work to compare and validate migrated content from Fedora 3 with the migrated Fedora 6 OCFL content. So that's really the focus here today. And again, we're going to take things fairly slowly to sort of walk through the details here and hopefully give all of you a chance to follow along if you'd like to do so. And yeah, you'll get a chance to test these tools if you'd like to do that. So I'm going to pause here briefly. I did send out an email to the attendees, so hopefully you got this in advance. If you didn't, that's not a problem. But some of these things are larger downloads and may take a little bit of time if you haven't pulled them down already. But what I'd recommend if you want to follow along with the hands-on content is to just create a folder on your computer in an easy to find place, particularly one that's easy to locate using a command line utility. And then the links to the two tools are embedded here. So they're both jar files that you can pull down from GitHub, Migration Utils and the Migration Validator. Towards the end of the workshop, we're going to use the Docker image for Fedora 6, really just to show what this content looks like in the new repository. If you'd like to get that, you need to have Docker installed and to pull down that image. And again, if you didn't do that in advance, you can certainly do that now and run it in the background, but it may take a little bit of time to pull down to your desktop. We did also generate a Fedora 3 sample set, and this comes from Scott Prater at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's very generously shared around their open data set for us to do a lot of our kind of testing and training on Fedora 6 using their Fedora 3 samples. And I asked Scott just to generate a sample set, and so there's about 100 objects in this sample set from their one of their test collections. And so if you download that, depending on your operating system, it may unzip it into a folder called Japan Rice Test Objects. If it doesn't, and if it just drops everything into the working folder, there are three files there, 3 folders. There's a data streams and an objects folder, and also an Akubra file. And so you want to just place those into a folder called Japan Rice Test Objects in order to participate here, just so that we're all kind of using the same sort of working directories, and it's easier for copying and pasting. And then finally, Java 11 is required for running through these exercises. So you'll want to have that on your machine if you'd like to participate. So I'll pause here just briefly just to make sure there's no questions that we need to address about the preparations. And if not, we'll jump into talking a little bit about the tools. And then for hands-on, I'm going to flip things over to Danny, who's going to share his desktop and kind of walk through step by step how to do some of this stuff. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any questions yet, but go ahead and stop me, Aaron, anytime anything comes up. But we'll go ahead and proceed here. So this is largely informational, but if you have a Fedora 3 repository, today we're using one based on Akubra, but Fedora 3 has a couple of different storage layout structures, and this is just kind of letting you know, based on your system, where you can find your objects and data streams, because you'll need to define these when using the tool. So I'm just going to walk through some of the most useful functions that the migration utils can do. This is not exhaustive, and if you go to the GitHub README files for these tools, you'll find a full list, or if you just run the Java jar command on the command line to activate the jar file, then it'll print out these options on your screen. So it's fairly easy to find these. But when you're defining your migration, you have to start by defining the type. As I mentioned earlier, you can migrate to Fedora OCFL or plain OCFL. And the difference here really is just for some folks, if you're interested in adopting the Oxford Common File layout, but you're not necessarily interested in sticking with Fedora, you can migrate your Fedora 3 content to just plain OCFL with no sort of Fedora specifics in it, and then use that with your own client or what have you. Whereas if you want to use Fedora 6, Fedora 6 does have some kind of application-specific information that it needs to have in those object files in order to read them in properly. Next, you have to define your source type. So as I mentioned, there's actually three. There's legacy and a Kubra, the two sort of file system layouts in Fedora 3, but you can also export your content. And if you export your repository, then you need to tell the migration tool that you've done so, and so it knows where to read things in from. You can set a limit, and this is useful if you're doing a test migration and you don't want to migrate your tens or hundreds of thousands of objects. If you just want to say process the first 100 resources and then check to make sure everything's working properly, that's a useful thing to do before you sort of jump into your production migration. You need to specify the target directory. This is just where the content will end up, and so this will for these exercises, this will end up being the folder where we stand up our Fedora 6 instance and point it to. And then if you're using either a Kubra or legacy, you need to tell it where your objects directory is and where your data streams directory is. This is fairly obvious for the test content, but the previous slide was just sort of giving you a sense of where you can find that if you're not sure. And if you're using the exported source type, then that doesn't apply. Instead, you would just tell Fedora, tell the tool where the exported directory is to pick up that content. Sorry, I have a duplicate on here, the migration type to Fedora plain OCFL. That's just a duplicate from the previous slide. Resume is if you run the tool and it stops at some point, or you want to pick up from a particular point, you can resume from the last migrated object, which might be useful if for whatever reason the tool fails partway through a migration. You don't necessarily have to restart from the very beginning. You can kind of resume from the last object that was successfully migrated. You can set a flag to continue on error, and this is quite useful, especially if you know that you have some broken objects in your Fedora 3 that you're not worried about migrating or that you want to just deal with later. Otherwise, by default, the tool will just stop when it hits an object that it can't migrate. So this is fairly useful. You'll still get a report, and we'll see sort of when Danny starts doing some testing that you can get a full log file, and it will tell you how many objects it processed and if any of them encountered errors, so you can kind of go back and fix things as needed. And you can, if you'd like, associate a username with the resources. By default, it's just going to use the Fedora admin username for everything, but you can assign a username if you'd like to do that. Just a few other things here. So you can actually provide it a list of PIDs or persistent identifiers, and these are what Fedora 3 used to kind of uniquely identify resources in the repository. So if you know you have certain objects that you want to migrate, if, for example, some objects failed and you had to repair them and then you wanted to migrate those specific PIDs. And so basically, you don't have to migrate your entire repository. You can just define a subset of resources and migrate those. By default, the data streams won't have file extensions on them, but you can add them with the tool if that's useful to you. You can also use define a host name to replace placeholders for your content. You can set the algorithm, so the checksum algorithm that's used for OCFL objects. There is a default here, but you can override it. OCFL requires checksums for everything. And so you can define the algorithm if that's something that you care about. You can also disable data stream checksum validation. So one of the things we discovered when piloting this tool, and when you have a lot of content and you're validating the data streams on every single object, this can significantly increase the time that it takes to migrate. And so you maybe want to validate every checksum on the way over, but you can potentially speed up your migration if you disable that. But when we get to the validator, you'll see that there is an option there to go back and validate all the data streams. So you do have the option to say, let's skip checksum validation for the migration just to get everything migrated, but then go back afterwards with the validator and say, now let's go ahead and validate all the checksums. But that could be done post-migration, so an operation that could potentially be kind of run in the background.
There is a question just in the chat, David, about the PID file option. Mm-hmm. Is it possible to use wildcards to search?
Oh,
looking like, for example, using the asterisks.
Yeah, Danny, I wonder if you could speak to that one. I'm actually not sure. You'll have to unmute yourself.
I don't think so. I don't think that's currently a feature. But if you're interested in that feature, I think that would be easy to add, and you could just go to our Jira site, which I can drop a link to that in the chat. 1 second. It would be good to log that, especially if you have an interest in that. And here is the Fedora Atlassian site. So you can sign up, create an account, and then just put in the issue, and then your name is attached to that, so that we know who's interested in seeing that happen.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And that's, I think, a good recommendation as well. Just sort of throughout here, we've developed these tools based on requirements from the pilots that we've been running and others in the community. But it's always possible to add more features. So if you have a particular requirement, for example, being able to wildcard PIDs in a PID list, there is a mechanism for requesting features. Danny just kind of laid that out. But also, if you're not super familiar with Jira and not sure how to create a ticket, feel free to get in touch with us. We can sort of point you in the right direction and help you get that issue created. But yeah, feature requests are welcome. And as I said, this list isn't completely exhaustive, but I'm just sort of trying to cover the highlights here. The final one I'll mention is the ability to enable metrics. So this again came out of the pilots, where there were some performance issues in some scenarios when running the migration tool, and we weren't totally able to identify where those kind of performance bottlenecks were happening. So we added a flag for generating metrics using Prometheus, and this is something we also have enabled in Fedora Core, where you can log performance on a variety of vectors and use a dashboard with something like Grafana to view those metrics and kind of identify where bottlenecks may be occurring. So that might be useful to you if you're, especially if you have a significantly large repository and the tool seems to be running slower than you would expect. Here is a command. Danny's going to use this, and this is where you can sort of copy and paste from the slides if you'd like to do things that way. Just very briefly, what's going on here is we're calling the migration utilities jar file, and just going back to the options I was just explaining, we're indicating that the migration type is Fedora OCFL, that the source is an Akubra file system. We're defining a target directory of Fedora home, which will just get created automatically if it doesn't exist already in your current working directory. And I should mention that this command should be run from whatever directory you created for the workshop where you're kind of depositing all these files. For the objects directory, it's the Japan Rice test objects / objects. So this directory should exist if you unzipped the file into that Japan Rice test objects directory. I think if you're on a Mac, that'll happen automatically. If you're on a different system, you might have to unzip and then move the files a little bit to get them in place. Similarly, with the data streams directory, it's exactly the same. Both objects and data streams should be right inside that test objects directory. We're going to define a working directory for all of the operations that are taking place during the running of the utility. And then finally outputting everything to a log file. If you don't do this, it'll just print everything to screen, which could be useful for you if you're just kind of running some tests, but it's quite helpful to output to a log file because you can go back afterwards and sort of search through that and find out if there's any error files. So I think Danny's going to show a little bit of that stuff.
Basically what you can see here is, here's my screen. I'm going to copy the migration command here. So this is basically what you had, what David just showed you. And I've set up all my directories so that this should just run, and actually, if I tail the log here, you can see that things are actually running. So this is now done. That was fairly quick. Not too many objects. Now that that's done, you can see, well, on this side, let me just show you here that we have, you can see the projects being, the objects being processed one by one.
Could you bump up the font just a little bit more there, Danny?
Sure. And you can see it gives you a pretty rich output. Here's a warning showing that there's a missing or invalid digest. So in some cases, this is not a problem. In this data set, there were some issues, but there it is. And what you can see here too is we have this migration work directory. And in here, you can see there was a Fedora 3 index that was generated. If you already have a Fedora 3 index for your, for your Fedora 3 repository, as you would if you had stood up, recently a Fedora 3, you could use that. So that would speed things up a bit. And you can see also here that we've generated a Fedora home directory, and inside you have the data, and there's your OCFL root. And so let me just go back to the slides here. We'll go back to here. We can look at the contents of the OCFL in case you haven't ever seen that. It's basically a giant directory of files, and it's, as you can see, it's got a very specific structure, which is the OCFL. What is challenging is to navigate this kind of structure if you actually wanted to inspect it. Not challenging in the sense that that it's sort of hard to do in terms of getting in there. It's just a simple directory structure, but it is a little bit challenging if you're just navigating this large tree. So what I can do here is, there are different tools, but one of them is Rockfall, which was developed by Peter Winkles from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And you can see here, this is the project, it's on GitHub. And it's basically an OCFL command line tool for looking at OCFL directories, looking at the file system, and doing all kinds of fancy and useful types of operations on it. So like doing a list, listing the objects, listing versions, looking at the log of changes to a particular object. So just for fun, we can take a quick look here at sort of some of these commands. I have this right here, which is just a simple list command. Okay, so there you can see there's a list of all the objects that have been imported. Now we could just take one of these objects here, and we can list it. So here, so I'm gonna take that there. Oh, it's interesting. Let me go here. All right. Okay, there we go. And then I'll make this large. So you can see right here is you have the sort of the contents of this file, of this object, and then what it's showing you is the path on disk to that resource, and then on the left-hand side, you have a listing of just the sort of containers relative to the object directory here. So if you take out this P here, which gives you this full path, you can have something that's a little bit more less verbose. Then we can just take another look at, for example, if you wanted to look at the let's see what we can look at here. This is the latest version. So I believe, I'm not sure how many versions this object has. There's actually a command for listing the number of versions, but I don't have that up right here. But this will show you within this object, what were all the resources for that version. And then you can also do things like look at the differences between two files or two versions. So you can look at the metadata, or you can look at the actual contents of the files. So yeah, I don't know if there are any questions about that. I think there's, to just emphasize this is a very useful tool. Chances are, if it's something you might look at if you're interested, but for doing the migration, it's not required that you actually inspect the OCFL. It's sort of like you've migrated the data, and then you validate it and stand up Fedora, and that's sort of the process. David, is there anything else there, something that was missed?
No, I think if you want to stop your screen share, I can
Okay.
flip back. But yeah, and just for folks' information, the Rockfall tool, I never know how to pronounce that, ROCFL, or I'm not sure how much Peter thought about pronunciation when he named it. But we decided not to sort of provide a whole bunch of instructions on that tool for this workshop, just because we're already sharing a bunch of new things with the migrator and the validator and Docker. We just thought it might be nice to kind of demo a couple of commands to show that it's another way of browsing the OCFL. We'll follow up afterwards with Danny. I already shared a link, and there's a link in the slides to the ROCFL, and it has a bunch of commands in it. Danny, maybe we can also just share those specific commands that you ran, since they would work on the data set that everyone's working with, just in case anyone wants to go back afterwards and kind of play around with that tool a little bit. But I can chat with you, but we can maybe just send a follow-up email with a few of those things.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the migration tool. And again, feel free to drop questions in. We're using a very small data set here just to kind of be able to move through things fairly quickly for demo purposes. We also want to demonstrate this validation tool, and this was included in the setup instructions, so you should have this available if you'd like to participate. And here's where we'll be able to kind of see the results of the migration from the perspective of, did everything come over the way I expected it to? So this list isn't exhaustive, but, and I've included a link here to the documentation for the tool. And actually, Danny, just as a note, I think we may need to update that documentation page. There were a few things that were required for the tool that may need to be sort of updated, just to indicate that those operations are all supported. But some of the operations.
Also,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt. The Rockfall link that's in the slides does not go to the correct spot. So I will.
Oh, maybe you can fix that. Okay, great. We'll update the slides, and thanks for that. Some of these things have been a little bit of a moving target in recent days. Some of you may have seen that we put out Fedora 6 release candidate, and actually a second release candidate just today, and we've been updating links to the release candidate versions of all of these tools kind of in tandem with producing slides and content. So apologies if there's a couple of links that are outdated or go to the wrong thing, and yeah, thanks for pointing those out. We'll update the slides and share out a new link with everything corrected. But yeah, this tool validates a number of sort of indicators in your resources. So whether it's sort of object metadata like the created date and the modified date, the list of data streams and the size of those data streams, making sure those are all the same. As I mentioned before, you can have the tool run a checksum, basically validate the checksums of all of your data streams. It's disabled by default because this does add time to the validation, which you might not need, but it's certainly an operation that's quite useful. Similarly with object count, you can basically compare the number of objects in the source repository to the destination repository. But this is also disabled by default just because you may, if for example, you're just migrating a list of PIDs, you know from the get-go that those counts are not going to match. So there's no point in validating that. But if you did run a full migration and you want to make sure that everything came over, then that is a useful option to enable. As well as things like the number of versions, etc. And there are other things, and Danny can demonstrate a couple of those in the output file when we go through that. Just in terms of general usage, it's very similar to the migration utils. You call it as a jar file and then provide a set of options on the command line. And again, I'll go through some of the most common ones here, and then we'll move over to a demo where Danny can show some of this stuff in action. Some of these are fairly basic. You can print out the help text. You can in the version of the tool itself. Similar to the migration utils, you do have to tell the tool what source type you're using, whether it's a Kubra, legacy, or exported, and also tell it where to find the data streams and objects directories, or if you're using the exported content, where to find that. So that is exactly the same as the migration utils, and I believe the flags themselves are also the same, just to make that easier. You can provide the host name for your Fedora 3 instance, and this is just if you happen to have external or redirect data streams in your source repository, providing the sort of host name to replace the placeholder for those. An index directory for the cached index of data streams. Danny mentioned that with migration utils, the same applies here. You can tell it where to put the actual validation results, which we'll do when we run the tool, and where your OCFL content is, where the sort of root of your Fedora 6 repository exists. It is possible to run the tool in parallel. I think the default number of threads is 5, but you can define more threads if you want to sort of increase the parallel processing. And again, you can give it a PID file, so that's exactly the same as with the migration utils. You can just validate a list of PIDs rather than validating the entire repository if that's what you need to do.
There's just a question here, David, from the chat. It says, are Fedora specific data streams, example XACML, converted into what FC6 expects, or does FC6 still use XACML?
So the tool basically just brings everything over as is. So if you have those XACML or XACML, data streams, those just come over. Fedora 6 does not use the same security features as Fedora 3, so there would still be some work to do once you've migrated everything to kind of update the permissions in Fedora, your Fedora 6 repository, to kind of work with the XACML restrictions that you had in place. I think that's a good use case. It wasn't one that we encountered when we were doing our pilot work. The pilots just didn't happen to use these particular security features. But if you have a Fedora 3 repository that uses those permissions, and you want to migrate and then convert those so they'll be useful in Fedora 6, I think we'd really love to hear from you on that. And it might be as simple as creating a ticket, or it might be a little bit more complicated, and maybe it's worth having a kind of a discussion around the use cases there. I don't know, Danny, I don't think this has been sort of encountered yet in the work that we've done so far, but it'd be good to hear more about those requirements.
Yeah, I don't think we have heard about that, although maybe it's worth mentioning that the FOXML files that have embedded data streams in them, the migration tool does extract those data streams and sort of plop them into their own files within the each OCFL object.
Yeah, so everything comes over, but there would be still some work to do to update things like permissions. So yeah, if you have those kinds of use cases, it would be great to hear from you on that. And you can always follow up with us via email, or we can create a ticket and maybe bring it up on the next tech call in terms of how do we take those Fedora 3 security and permissions and update those to work with Fedora 6, which uses a different scheme. So some of the other options here, you can generate a report type. The default is an HTML report, but you can also get a CSV or TSV report for your content, and Daniel will show a little bit of that so you can see how that works. As I mentioned, you can run checksum validations, but you don't need to do that. You can define the digest algorithm to use during that validation. A couple of options are enabled there. You can check the number of objects if you need to do that. You can also validate only the most recent version of a data stream rather than every previous version, again, just depending on whether you want to sort of speed things up or if that's just your particular use case. And you can also enable debugging, so you can kind of see how things, if you do run into problems, you can kind of get some debug information there. So I'll flip it back over to Danny here in a second just to run through this. But again, this is very, very similar to the migration utils. You run the jar file defining the source type, in this case, a Kubra, the data streams directory and the objects directory, again, same as last time, and the OCFL root directory, which is going to be inside this Fedora home directory that we created last time. And we're going to define the report type as HTML. It will do that by default. But just when Danny does the demo, he's also going to show a different report type for doing the validation. So why don't I stop sharing my screen so that you can flip back over, Danny, and then go ahead and run the validator.
Okay. So you can see I'm in the same directory. The workshop, what I created on my machine is the workshop directory, and I pasted in this command. As David mentioned, this is the HTML report, which is the default. I'm going to just run this, and as you can see, it's kind of runs quickly. If you and that's done. I'm just going to clear this here, and let's look at so the output directory is where, I think that's not what I wanted to do. Let's go into the output directory, and you can see that there are these two directories here. This is sort of raw JSON that's used to process the HTML report, but if you happen to be interested in the JSON, it's there. But really, what you would do is just go into the into this directory, and you can open the so the directory is output HTML, and then you just open that, and then you can see here that we have the summary, and here you can see we have 112 objects, and then
just zoom in a little bit, Danny. Just
okay. Yeah, what's this? I'm going to just.
Oh, it's not responsive. Yeah.
So, yeah. So basically, you can see that you have. Let's see if I can. Yeah, this needs to be styled a little bit, but we have 112 objects here. You should be able to see the number of failed objects is 0. If we drill down into one of these objects, we can see that we have. There are 34 checks that have been done on this object, and all of them passed. If there were errors, you would see them here. And then here you have kind of this summary. In this case, there were no failed validations, so we don't see anything there. These are at the top, so that they're, because they'll be, you'll be most interested in those, but in case you're interested in what was done, you can see that each validation and the status. So in this case, you have different validation levels. So you have the object level, and then you have the object resource level. So the object is like the, looking at the sort of compound object, the metadata associated with it, and sort of the number of resources and versions within that object. So here we can see we have there's the check that the source object exists in the target, and then it gives you a reference to the source and target objects, which then if you wanted to go into the OCFL, you could use Rockfall or some other tool to actually investigate those. Here we have the metadata. It's checking the active flag in Fedora. Here's the label, the owner ID, the create date, modify date, and so on. Here it's just making sure that the head creation dates are the same. So you can see there's quite a lot happening under the hood here, and really the main point of this is just to, when you migrate your content, to feel confident that everything is just as you would expect it to be. In fact, as we migrate, there are validations, as David mentioned. When you run migration utils, there are validations that are done to make sure that the objects are intact, and there are checksum checks and so on. But this is, again, just another layer. Even you could say it's even redundant in some cases, but it gives you that extra confidence that all went well, and it's sort of like an independent check. So then let's go back here. We can say, let's go back up to the directory where we were, and let's just look at this as a CSV. So we can regenerate the report. And then if you're more comfortable on the command line, CSV, we could take any one of these. So what you can see here is that, actually, I'm just going to regenerate this as TSV, because that's how I originally set this up, and it will flow a little better.
Yeah, and just to note, for those of you that might want to follow along here, if you move along to there's a slide for viewing the TSV results that just kind of demonstrates what Danny just did there, which was largely just changing HTML to TSV, just in case anyone wanted to kind of keep up on the slides.
So if you go into the TSV directory, you can see where we are. We're in output TSV. And if I do an ls, you can see basically each object has its own tab separated file. And if you want to, you can look at them all together or individually. They're just broken out for convenience. If you want to sort of grep everything or look at everything, you could do oops. I'll look at these here. So here you can see, I'm going to make my screen larger. It's sort of hard to see. This is a tab separated file. It's raw, but if you wanted to grep for an OK status, that gives you this. I don't think there are any errors in this file, or I think it's fail. Yeah, so there are no failures. I don't believe there's any warnings either. Yeah. So Or, if you want to look at an individual file, you can do that as well, by going here.
Probably need to increase your font size a little bit too, Danny. Just a little hard to see.
Go up, and you can see. So what I did here was, I'm just catting the TSV of an individual file. And so if you want a more targeted look and not having to grep through everything, if you have a very large collection, that could be slow. And there you go. So you can essentially run automated processes on these files. If the web HTML tool is useful for just getting in there and taking a quick look, but if you wanted to do some automation, this would be the way to go, using the TSVs and CSVs. Let's see what else here. Yeah, so that was that. Yeah, so should we, I don't know, David, should we go right into the Docker setup here? Or?
Yeah, and again, if folks have questions, feel free to drop them in. You could also, of course, with these TSV and CSV files, open them up in a spreadsheet editor like Excel or something like that if you want to see something a little bit more visual. I know we're doing a lot of stuff on the command line here, but that is, of course, still supported. Yeah, if maybe if we go back, if you want to give up the screen sharing momentarily here.
Okay.
Danny, just
sure.
So I can flip back before we do the next part here. Just to talk a little bit about what we're doing next. So, we ran the migration tool, and then we ran the validation, and Danny did some file browsing to show sort of what things look like in the OCFL structure on the command line. But we can also take a look at what these things actually look like in an instance of Fedora 6. So if you had pulled down the Docker image that we specified earlier, this next section is really just to show you how you can stand up that Docker image and have it actually read in the migrated content. So if you just stood up the Docker, it would not have anything in it, of course, because it's just built off of the image. So these next couple of slides, just to be clear, what we're doing here is we're just providing some properties to Docker when we stand it up to tell it where this Fedora home directory is, this migrated content. So we're essentially mapping this local directory where we migrated stuff to the Docker container so that it can then read it in and build an index. And so there are a couple of steps here, and Danny's going to run through a demo of this, but I just wanted to make sure to run through this slowly enough so that folks can follow along if you'd like to. And there's basically just two steps. The first is that we're creating an fc repo.properties file, just again in your main working directory for the workshop. And we're giving it that Fedora home property. So we're going to do this on the command line with an echo command. If you'd prefer, you can just open up a standard text editor and put this the property file that's the property that's in quotes here in the text file. But if you're already on the command line, just running the echo command is the easiest way to do it. It'll create the file automatically when you run this command. And then Danny will demonstrate this, but just to be clear, this is the command that we can use to run the create a container and run for the Docker image that that everyone hopefully pulled down if you'd like to participate. And there's just two spots here that are bolded that you'll need to pay attention to. The only trick with this command is that you need to give it an absolute path to where your Fedora home directory is and where your properties file is. Those should be in the same directory. If you've been following the instructions here, you can use something like a Pwd command to sort of see what that working directory is. And so Danny's going to demonstrate this, but you can either copy and paste this onto the command line and then sort of manually edit the path to statements, or if you find it easier, you could copy and paste this into a text editor and then do the kind of copying and pasting in the text editor so that you get the paths right, and then kind of put that back on the command line. So this is just want to slow that down a little bit, because this is probably the trickiest part of the workshop to sort of follow along with. You can't directly copy and paste this command because we don't know what the absolute path to your folder is going to be. It's going to be different for everyone. But this is, but Danny's going to demonstrate it. But in any case, this step might take a couple of minutes to sort of properly set up in your case. But you'll see once we're able to do this that we can actually browse all of this content that we've migrated in a Fedora 6 instance. So I'll turn it back over to you, Danny. I just wanted to slow things down a little bit there to make sure that folks can follow along if they'd like to.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, maybe I'll just note here that, so I've already created my Fedora properties file, which you can look at here, FC Repo properties, and I just have this one property in there, the Fedora home directory. Just a note that this properties file can contain all kinds of configurable properties, which we're not going to go into, but just as a little moment to be aware of all the options. I'm going to just drop that in there, but there are, tons of things that you can, different configuration points, ways of configuring your OCFL, your messaging, you can even write to S3 and so on. So just to be aware. And then I'm just going to paste my Docker command in. So notice here, this is just a standard Docker run statement. You've got your ports being mapped. So we're running in a Tomcat container. So we're going to map the port 8080 to 8080 on the local machine. And we've got our, we're right here, we're mapping the directory to the Fedora home directory on my machine to the Fedora home in the Docker container. So this is what David was talking about. Notice how I have the full path here to my Fedora home directory. And then the properties file, you can pass using this environment flag, the Catalina ops, if you want to configure your Tomcat. In this case, we're going to pass in, this is how we actually pass in the properties, is through this Tomcat Catalina ops property. And then I've just named the container here, Fedora 6, RC1. Notice here, this is, again, you pulled this down, this right here sort of tells Docker to go to Docker Hub and pull down the cloud image. This is what we published to Docker Hub. And in fact, we just published an RC2 yesterday. So just for the sake of this demo, though, I'm going to use the RC1. And then we just start it up. So what you can see is right here, all this output that you see is really from the Tomcat logs, and it's just showing that Fedora has started up. It tells you, kind of what the properties are, where the OCFL directory is, what it thinks it's, what it thinks the properties are. That can be helpful. And let's see, in this case, you can see right down here, as part of the startup, a rebuild is initiated. So what that's doing is essentially reading the OCFL and then constructing useful indexes from that in order to, so a search index and containment index, just to make the Fedora essentially snappy. I think it's worth noting here that if you have a huge repository, with say, millions of items, you may consider, using a beefier instance of for your Fedora and have a separate kind of beefy database instance for processing the rebuild activities. I mean, it will rebuild in time, but if you have a truly large repository on the scale of millions of items, it could take quite a long time, like days to rebuild, depending on how large your instances are. But if you beef up the instances, the index does happen in a kind of based, it will scale with the number of processors. And so you can, for example, it might take on a small machine, it might be 50 items per minute. On a larger, very large instance, you can get 1,000. Sorry, did I say 50 per minute or 50 per second versus like, 1,000 or 2,000 per second, depending on how big your machine is. So one of the things that I've done in the past is if I have a large collection, I just spin up using AWS, of course, a large instance for the rebuild. And then once the rebuild is complete, then I just change the instance type. So it's a smaller machine. All right, so now that things are up and running, I can go over to my local host here. And I don't know if you can see that, but I'm just going to localhost 8080 FC repo rest. And here you can see the list of objects that were generated. Okay. And then we can browse to one of those. We can see what the
You want to zoom just a little bit, Danny? That's yeah, thanks.
Okay. So you can see here are the individual resources. If, say, you were looking for an object and you can go to the search here, you can look at the Fedora ID and say, the Fedora ID is something like master. You see it brings up all the masters. And there's actually, this gives you some hints about the search capability, but let me just drop a link here as well for sort of all the possibilities that search gives you. So yeah, and the intention with the simple search was previously there just wasn't in Fedora 4 and 5 an easy way to sort of look at the, search the contents of your repository. You could browse, but there wasn't by default a kind of search facility. So there it is, your repository. You can download your resources, you can browse them. You can, and then operate. You can then start building on that repository by adding new resources, test resource. I can just add that, and there it is. Yeah, any questions? But yeah, if there is a use case there that is desired, Fedora 6 is about to be released, but 6.0.1 or 6.1 is not far behind. And really, yeah, we look to the community for the direction on what people want to see. So yeah, if you want to see it, let us know and we can try to make it happen.
And so if there are folks that have data in the RELSext and they want to have that sort of pulled out and mapped to properties, for example, either during a migration and it is certainly something that could be done post-migration because we're just talking about adding RDF properties. But yeah, let's it'd be great to sort of get a little bit more information on what would be useful there.
I think that the important thing is to know sort of specifically and precisely what it is that you would like to see, how you would like the final state of the objects to be, and we can work with you on that.
Yeah, I think as we get to the Fedora 6 release, we sort of shift our focus. Definitely, um, supporting migrations is going to be a major focus for us over the next year. We're putting out a bunch of resources on this, and obviously we've developed these tools, but this is an iterative process. So yeah, definitely let us know if there's stuff missing here that we can address. So and thanks, Danny, for sharing all the demo stuff, and thanks everyone for all of your questions and comments. I think it's quite useful to hear about some of these other use cases for other facilities in Fedora 3 that maybe we're not supporting yet, but could certainly be supported, whether it's during the migration or post migration. I think both of those are possibilities, and it'd be good to hear from folks if there's a preference for one or the other of those, or if a post migration fix would be good enough, or if having something in the migration utility itself would be best. But in any case, provide some links here. Mentioned earlier that we are in the second release candidate for Fedora 6.0. None of the issues raised here really have to do with the core software. So doing things like handling relsext or XACML policies, so those sorts of things would all be handled sort of in the migration tool or another sort of post migration tool. But we do anticipate having the core software released here within the next week or so. So you're welcome to test that and provide some feedback on it. If you're using the Docker that we use today, that's based on the RC1, and the Docker is probably the easiest way to do local testing. We do have some migration documentation that's based on the exercises here today, but then also provides pathways for Fedora 4 and 5 for migration. So you'd be certainly encouraged to try that stuff out and let us know if there's gaps and things that are not working for you. You can always participate in the development efforts. We've been encouraging folks to create tickets, which is sort of an easy way to participate. Providing use cases, providing requirements. That's a great way to contribute. But we also do run regular sprints and have tickets to work on if folks would like to contribute that way. We have a fairly active Slack that you can join if you'd like to do sort of synchronous conversations with the team members. And maybe, Aaron, if you could just dig up the link to the communication channels if you haven't posted that already. Just because we do also have mailing lists for sort of more asynchronous conversations, which can be helpful, especially when folks are in different time zones. And of course, if you're not already supporting us as an institutional member, I'd encourage you to do that. And I do want to say thank you to all of our members, in addition to the grant funds, which certainly helped provide the tools and documentation and the time for this workshop. We are just supported on an ongoing basis by a global group of members that are institutions that use the software and fund all of our activities, including all of the staff positions for the folks on the line here, and our ability to keep the software up to date over time. And this is also how, after the grant period ends, we'll be able to continue supporting the resources that have been created, such as this one, and updating them regularly. So again, thank you to everyone that supports us in this way. And if you're an institution that uses Fedora and benefits from these resources, I'd certainly encourage you to contribute at whatever level is reasonable for you. So I'll leave my contact info at the end. I'm probably the best person to reach out to as just a contact point. I can always refer people to others such as Danny or to our community channels. If you do have technical questions or things like that, the mailing list or the Slack are probably the best way to get a response fairly quickly. That's where the team really will be available for you. But if you're just not sure, or if you'd rather send a private message, that's perfectly fine as well. So feel free to do that.